Social conservatism is a response to changing cultural mores that eventually find their way into law. The pro-life movement, for example, gained steam after the U.S. Supreme Court hands down Roe v. Wade. Ironically, since that court decision, the pro-life movement has had remarkable success in changing many minds on the issue of abortion, even though the courts have upheld very few restrictions on the practice. However, as many libertine beliefs about human sexuality, marriage, entertainment, gambling, pornography, etc., have gained mainstream currency in American culture, social conservatives have not only changed few minds, they have slowly over time appropriated these new mores into their own private lives and institutions. Although social conservatism arises as a counter to the sexual revolution, the advocates of which had argued that they simply wanted to be left alone, social conservatives now find themselves fighting for the preservation and integrity of their own institutions and religious conscience because their political adversaries will not leave them alone. The great irony here is that the once impressive liberal defenders of the freedoms of speech, religion, and association have transformed themselves into the prudish, reactionary busybodies that had been the object of their own ridicule and derision in the 1960s through the 1980s. For example, during oral arguments in Obergefell v. Hodges, Justice Samuel Alito, relying on the reasoning of the 1983 case, Bob Jones v. the United States, asked U.S. Solicitor General Donald Verrilli if private religious colleges would be subject to loss of tax-exempt status if same-sex marriage were to be legally recognized as a constitutional right. General Verrilli answered, quote, "You know, I don't think I can answer that question without knowing more specifics. But it's certainly going to be an issue. I don't deny that. I don't deny that, Justice Alito. It is going to be an issue," unquote. This, by the way, is the dominant view among elites. For instance, University of Chicago philosopher and legal scholar Martha Nussbaum has suggested that the reasoning of the Bob Jones case should apply to Catholic universities that require their presidents to be priests. Why? She believes that because this requirement means that only men can hold these presidencies, because only men can become Catholic priests, it stands to reason this policy is discriminatory and the schools should lose their tax-exempt status. This movement toward the ideological colonization of religious conscience, as both Pope Francis and Cardinal Robert Sarah have labeled it, was put on full display this past week when WikiLeaks released private email exchanges between Jennifer Palmeri of the Clinton campaign, John Halpin, Sandy Newman, and John Podesta of the Center for American Progress. Commenting on the fact that Rupert Murdoch, who owns the Wall Street Journal, and Robert Thompson, its managing editor, were raising their children Catholic, Halpin writes, quote, "Friggin," he actually put friggin, so he watched himself. "Friggin, Murdoch baptized his kids in the Jordan where John the Baptist baptized Jesus. Many of those powerful elements of the conservative movement are all Catholic, many converts, from the Supreme Court and think tanks to the media and social groups. It's an amazing bastardization of their faith. They must be attracted to the systematic thought and severely backwards gender relations and must be totally unaware of Christian democracy," unquote. Palmeri replied, quote, "I imagine they think it is the most socially acceptable, politically conservative religion. Their rich friends wouldn't understand if they became evangelicals," unquote. Halpin responded, "Excellent point. They can throw around Thomistic thought and subsidiarity and sound sophisticated because no one knows what the hell they're talking about," unquote. 10 months later, Newman expressed frustration with the fact that many Catholics do not agree with their church on social issues. This is what he writes. "There needs to be a Catholic spring in which Catholics themselves demand the end of a Middle Ages dictatorship and the beginning of a little democracy and respect for gender equality in the Catholic Church." Podesta replied, quote, "We created Catholics in Alliance for the Common Good to organize for a moment like this, but I think it lacks the leadership to do so now. Likewise, Catholics United. Like most spring movements, I think this one will have to be bottom up," unquote. Both those organizations, by the way, have been around for quite some time, and it's come out through WikiLeaks that they've been funded by George Soros. As a practical matter, this crusade for liberal hegemony has been most successfully prosecuted in several cases involving proprietors who have run afoul of certain anti-discrimination laws. The most well-known cases have concerned a baker in Colorado, a photographer in New Mexico, and a florist in Washington State. In each case, the proprietor declined to do business with a gay or lesbian couple who tried to procure their services for a ceremony or event that celebrated the couple's wedding. Each of the parties offered different legal accounts. It depended on the nature of the law in the particular state. So some states had state versions of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Others had just a provision in the Constitution that was similar, if not identical, to our First Amendment. So each party argued differently for why they should receive an exemption under the state's law or under the anti-discrimination law. Nevertheless, in every case, the courts ruled in favor of the complainant couple, maintaining the proprietor, by declining service, discriminated against the customer based on his or her sexual orientation in violation of the jurisdiction's anti-discrimination law. It was interesting, the lawyers for the defendants in these cases all made an argument that I thought was a very plausible argument, but none of them were accepted by the courts, and that it wasn't the sexual orientation of the customer, but the nature of the ceremony. And that seemed to make sense. In a recent article I published in online journal published by Liberty Fund called Law and Liberty, I use an illustration to kind of explain this. Imagine you know of somebody, we'll call him Russell. I pick Russell because Russell Moore is a friend of mine and he's a Baptist. This involves a Baptist. So supposing Russell Moore is a photographer and he's a very devout Baptist, and his friend Aristotle Jones, comes to see him, and he says, and Aristotle happens to be Greek Orthodox. And Aristotle says, Russell, I'd like to hire you to take photographs at the baptism of my son Socrates. And so Russell says, Aristotle, you're a friend, but I don't believe that event that you're actually taking Socrates to is really a baptism. I believe in believer's baptism. That's what I believe as a Baptist. And so I really feel it's uncomfortable and awkward for me to cooperate with that. In fact, I'll take a picture of you and Socrates by any body of water you want. In a bathtub, in the ocean, by a hose, etc. But at the end of the day, what I will not do is participate in a liturgical event that I don't think is real. Okay? And so what does Aristotle do? He says, I'm sorry, my friend, but that's okay. We'll still remain friends, and I'll hire the Catholic photographer down the street. He has no problem with infant baptism. That, to me, sounds like a really persuasive argument. For some reason, the courts rejected that. Now, in a concurring opinion in the New Mexico case, Justice Richard Bossum suggests that religious liberty must sit in the back of the secular bus once those who choose to exercise it enter the marketplace. And this is a quote from the concurring opinion. The defendants are free to think, to say, to believe, as they wish. They may pray to the God of their choice and follow those commandments in their personal lives wherever they lead, unquote. Notice the language of the market, the God of their choice, as if our beliefs are simply those things that we arrive at, like when we arrive at a supermarket, right? Honey, I'm going to Trader Joe's. Can I pick up something? Yeah, why don't you pick up some Buddhism while you're there, right? That's not the way people think about their religious beliefs. In fact, if you think about it, most of the beliefs you hold, you don't consciously choose them. Try unbelieving that you're here, right? And most of our theological beliefs are like that. It's not a matter of will. We oftentimes come to our beliefs in indirect ways. Sometimes we just find ourselves believing those things. But to treat religion as if it were just a commodity is itself, I think, just one of the most offensive things that I can possibly imagine. But for somebody that has been tutored in their entire adult life in that way of thinking, it does seem to make sense. So let me continue here in the justice's opinion. The Constitution protects the defendants in that respect and much more, but there is a price, one that we will all have to pay somewhere in our civic life. In the smaller, more focused world of the marketplace, of commerce, of public accommodation, the defendants have to channel their conduct, not their beliefs, so as to leave space for other Americans who believe something different. In short, I would say to the defendants with the utmost respect, it is the price of citizenship, unquote. So here one finds the logic of the market, the idea of man as merely homo economicus, his citizenship reducible to the roles of buyer and seller, being employed as a means by which to eliminate from our view what many of us believe is more fundamental to our natures as human beings, our beliefs about those ultimate and permanent things by which our conscience is guided. The lesson for those of us who consider ourselves religious and social conservatives is clear. We need to care about politics because politics, whether we like it or not, cares or will care about us. The idea that the government will, quote unquote, leave the church alone as long as it minds its own business has been rarely borne out in practice historically. To be sure, the American experiment, until relatively recently, is the exception and not the norm in human history. But there's no assurance that it will not eventually appropriate the growing hostility to religious free exercise found among elites in education, law, and media. For this reason, social and religious conservatives have to be especially diligent in protecting the integrity of the message and mission of their own institutions, including churches, schools, and charitable organizations, even if it means boldly challenging the conventional wisdom of the dominant culture.